Today we come to part 3 of our current series, a series that we are calling Creating Space in Our Lives. And again, some of you in retirement, some of you with busy schedules in terms of volunteering, I hope that wherever you are in life, this might speak to your hearts. Because I think even in the midst of any aspect of our lives, whatever place we are in life, so often we don't clear holy space as God wants us to define it. So that's a really important thing that we're going to dig into today. If you had to miss one or both of the last 2 weeks, I do always want to encourage you, go online, listen in, and take a look and take a listen as to what we talked about. Here's where we've been focused so far in this series. We've been focused on what it means to be really good Sabbath keepers, or maybe let me say it this way, just to use more common language. So far in this series, we've been focused on what it means to weekly, intentionally clear space in our lives, not only so that we might experience some rest, physical rest, mental rest, emotional rest, but also so that in that time, we might more deeply connect to our God. Now, even though we are week 3, I want to come back to some questions that Christians often find come to mind when they think about Sabbath. Maybe this is something we should have started with, but even though we're week 3, today, as we kick things off, I want us to think about some questions. And I bet these are things, all 3 of them, that have come to your mind when you think about clearing holy space in your life. First question that often comes to Christians' minds when they think of Sabbath. Does the Sabbath that we keep, does it have to be a Sunday each and every week? Meaning, is a key part of Sabbath when it happens. Us freeing up Sundays, just like the Jews freed up Saturdays. And if it has to be a Sunday, then what does that mean for people who work on Sundays? And that does apply to some of you, though it applies mostly to those of you who are not here. You may be listening in, perhaps not while you're working, that may not work, but you will listen in later. What does that mean for those who work if Sabbath has got to be a Sunday? And the implication in the midst of this series is it doesn't have to be a Sunday, but it does need to be space cleared in the week. Another question that often crops up when people think Sabbath. Does the Sabbath that we're trying to keep, does it have to be a solid 24-hour period of time? Or can it be half of one day and half of another? The Jews looked at their Sabbath as sundown on Friday through sundown on Saturday. And the question for us is, do we need to look at Sabbath in the same way? It's got to be a span of time like that. But then a third question that can even come to mind when we think Sabbath is this: what does it really mean to keep the Sabbath faithfully as God would have us keep it? Or what does it mean to really make that time holy? Guys, it's that question, actually, that the people in Jesus' day, that's the question they struggled with most. Because for them, think about this, they knew it was going to be Saturday. They knew it was going to be a 24-hour period of time. What they at times struggled with was, what does it mean to keep it? Exactly. And for them, they would even word it this way. So what does it mean exactly to not work on the Sabbath? Interesting thing about that question they struggled with was how they tried to answer it. Because here's how they tried to answer it. By creating, the religious leaders of that day, by creating a whole bunch of rules that they were to keep in order to make sure they kept the Sabbath. And by doing that, what did they end up, in essence, doing? Actually, with that set of man-made rules in hand, that actually led them to often really miss out on the true meaning of Sabbath, the true purpose of Sabbath. Just for fun, here are some examples of what we're talking about. Only going to toss out a few. First one, you'll probably say, yeah, that makes sense, to not do that on the Sabbath. But consider some of the others as these religious leaders of that day kind of led the people into minutia. You'll see what I mean. These are some of the rules that they created surrounding Sabbath. One, to not work for them at that time meant you were not to plant on the Sabbath, which meant watering or fertilizing or planting seeds. And we nod our heads, we get that. We say, yeah, that makes sense. That would be a way for them to keep the Sabbath holier, not to work in that way. Second thought, to not work also meant you were not to reap on the Sabbath. Again, agrarian society and culture focused on those things. Makes sense. They would say, yeah, you're also not to reap. However, here's how they drifted into minutia. That even applied to simply picking grain as you walked through a field. Jesus is going to speak to this in the first part of our passage that we're looking at today. To not work meant to not plow on the Sabbath. We go, okay, also a part of work in an agrarian culture. And yet, here's the minutia connected to that. To not work also meant you were not even allowed to drag a chair in soft soil on the Sabbath because the legs would create a furrow, and technically that would be the same as plowing. Think of how far they drifted away from what God wanted Sabbath to mean for them. To not work also meant you could not write on the Sabbath. And all that meant was you couldn't connect two words together that made a coherent thought. But here's what's really fun about that rule. This rule also came along with that. To not work also meant you were not allowed to erase on the Sabbath. Imagine if you connected two words and you thought, oops, and then you thought, gosh, I'm going to break the Sabbath again if I try to rectify this. So you settle on, I wrote, I'll have to stop there. Now, here's the bottom line. Clearly, when God's people long ago thought about keeping the Sabbath, and man, this is what we want to steer clear of, this legalism only. Clearly, when they thought about keeping the Sabbath, the more rules they created, the more they began to lose sight of, again, the true meaning God wanted them to find here. So that's what we want to take a look at today. How Jesus moves us through this passage we're going to look at. How Jesus moves us beyond all this minutia in order to show us what keeping the Sabbath really is all about. To get into this today, we're going to take a look at a couple of passages in the Gospel of Mark. The first passage starts with verse 23 of Mark 2. We're going to read a few verses there. I think all of this is on your insert. It'll also be up on the screens. And then we're going to take a look at another story that is in Mark 3. It'll start with verse 1 and run through verse 6. Let me just say this in order to set all of this up. At that time, the Pharisees, they were the keepers of the law in Jesus' day. At that time, they often were watching Jesus very, very closely to try to catch him breaking the law in some way or another. And they thought if they could call him a lawbreaker, if they could see him breaking the law, then that would diminish his authority, that would diminish his standing in the eyes of the people. And so what we're going to see in this passage today, in part, is just that. Them trying to catch him doing something wrong. But then more importantly, we're also going to see this here. We're going to see Jesus responding to them in a way that, again, shows us what the Sabbath is really supposed to be all about. Give a listen to what we find here. Starting with Mark 2, verse 23. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields. And as his disciples walked along, they simply began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, again, they're hovering there to catch him doing something wrong. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He answered, "Have you never read what David did?" He's referring to his ancestors, to their ancestors. Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." Say that with me. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And then he says, "So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." So first we have that story in the second chapter. But then in chapter 3, starting with verse 1, we find another just wonderful story, speaking to the true meaning that Sabbath is to have for us. Here's what we read in Mark 3, verses 1 through 6. "Another time Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, 'Stand up in front of everyone.' Then Jesus asked them," who are them? Talking to the religious leaders. Jesus asked them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill?" And of course, they know the answer to that, but it's in part because they know the answer to that they respond in the way that they do. It says simply, they remained silent. You ever ask someone a question? Maybe especially you moms ask a child a question and you get silence back. You know that they get it without even saying that. So Jesus knows that's the case. And then we have this in verses 5 and 6. He looked around at them in anger, and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. And the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. Now, here's what we want to take hold of here. Simply this. What can we learn here about the Sabbath, again, in order to better understand what it means to keep it? There are three things I think we need to take a look at here. So consider these today. Here's a first thought. A first thing we learn about Sabbath here is this, that first off, Sabbath, true Sabbath, is all about restoration. It isn't just about inactivity. It's all about renewal and rejuvenation. It's not just about inactivity. Now, here's why it's important for us to claim that. One of the things that had clearly happened since the law had been given to the people by Moses, one of the things that had happened, we said this before, but now we're kind of talk about why. One of the things that had happened was the religious leaders clearly had forgotten what Sabbath was to be all about, because they turned it into a day when you needed to focus on a bunch of don'ts, right? I mean, that's primarily what they did with that day. What you were not to do was to be the emphasis. Contrast that emphasis on don't. Contrast that with what Jesus chooses to do on the Sabbath according to Mark 3, meaning even though Jesus knew the law, guys, Jesus knew that the law called him to inactivity, to not take action when he meets this man who needs healing. Even though he knows that, he chooses to do what? He chooses to take action very intentionally. Action that leads this man to being restored to health. And when we see him behave in that way, that leads us again to this first thought. If Sabbath isn't about inactivity, but is in fact about taking action, action that leads you and me to restoration, to renewal, to rejuvenation. If that is in fact the case, then our question is this: what activities do we need to be embracing in the midst of Sabbath so that we might experience those very things? Now, one thing that can always be a really big help to us is what we're doing right now. Again, for those who work on Sundays, they've got to find other ways to worship and praise God. But for those of us who can embrace this day, this is one of the ways we find renewal, rejuvenation. But here's the deal. Beyond this, the question remains, what else do we need to be doing in the midst of our cleared space, in the midst of our Sabbath, to truly find renewal, restoration? Because if we're not finding those things in the midst of the space that we've cleared in our lives, question is that really Sabbath time? Is that really what God would have it be in our lives? Second thing we learn here about Sabbath is this: that Sabbath is also a gift, not an obligation. It is a gift that God gives to us, not an obligation that He intends to simply be a burden to us. Guys, here's what we have to understand about any of God's commandments. They can always become a burden to us if we allow that to happen. Something that weighs us down, wears us out, makes us think, why do I have to do this? Or they can become what God intended them to be. They can be things that we truly see as blessings, as gifts, things that we know if we live them out, life will be naturally better. So knowing that we can go one of two ways, here's what needs to guide us in that. Here's what needs to determine whether we look at these things as blessing or burden. What Jesus offers to us here in verse 27, I had you offer these words after I offered them earlier. Remember these words. The Sabbath was made for you, not you for the Sabbath. Blessing versus burden. The Sabbath was made for you, not you for the Sabbath. Guys, imagine God creating a bunch of commandments, right? And then saying, oh gosh, I better create some people who can keep these, right? Doesn't work that way. God creates you out of love, and then and only then does God create some commandments. And why does He create them at that point? Because He knows if we'll embrace them fully, our lives will be better. Ask yourself, secondly, today, do you see God's call to Sabbath? Do you see God's call to clear space in your life? Do you see that as a gift that God has given to you? Because that's what it is. And when we get stuck in obligation mode, when we get caught up in this is just a burden, and we miss out, we fail to recognize the renewal, the rejuvenation that can come through that time with God. And then here's a third lesson I think we can pull out of this passage today. No matter how much we might try to define Sabbath and what it means to keep the Sabbath, and certainly, again, the religious leaders of his day tried to do that. We learn here that no matter how much we might try to define Sabbath, ultimately, Sabbath is truly defined by Jesus, especially through some words He offers us in the Gospels. Some of you are going to remember a time when a young lawyer comes to Jesus. This young lawyer comes to Jesus simply to ask, Jesus, would you tell me what's the most important commandment? You know, I want to prioritize that. I want to focus on that in my life. I want to make that kind of the number one thing in my life. Jesus, what's the most important commandment? In response to that, what does Jesus say? He says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. But then also keep this closely at hand. Love your neighbor as yourself. Now, are we to believe when he says that that means all the other commandments are no longer important at all? No. What he means when he says it just that way is this. If we will look at every other commandment through the lens of what is most important, if we'll look at every other commandment through the lens of love God, love others, then we'll better understand what it means to keep them. And that especially applies to the Sabbath. Guys, think about it this way. As you try to figure out in the complexity of your life, your schedule, your work, your activities, as you try to figure out how to clear some holy space in the midst of that, to create better work-life balance, as you try to do that, imagine simply coming back to these two questions over and over. Okay, God, if I order my week in this way, if I carve out some space in my week in this way, thinking this can be Sabbath. God, first off, if I do it in this way, will that allow me? Will that lead me to put you first, to love you most? And further, God, if I order my week in this way, if I create Sabbath in this way, will that also help me to love my neighbor better? Do you see how those kinds of questions, looking at Sabbath through the lens of love God, love others, love God, love others, how much that can help us to define that time? And so begin to ask yourself as you face another week, thinking about how Jesus here moves us beyond the minutiae, saying, look at Sabbath through the lens of love God, love others. As you think about that, ask yourself lastly, is your Sabbath right now? As you clear space in life, does that guide you to show God that He is first and to love your neighbor better? It's one thing to have God say to us, keep the Sabbath, make it holy. It's quite another thing to truly understand what that means for sure. So guys, grab onto what we've looked at today, what we've gleaned from the Gospel of Mark. Grab onto that, reflect on that as you face another week, that you might go deeper into keeping Sabbath in your life. Let's pray.